There isn't a scenario there where lockdown is going to be the answer. And that's why it wasn't in any of the pandemic plans anywhere in the world, because it wouldn't work. It's not worth having. It's not, and it's clearly going to be harmful.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, Dr Clare Craig, diagnostic pathologist and co-chair of the HART Group. Clare discusses common myths and misunderstandings during the pandemic.
There are people, including young people, who remain terrified and whose whole lives continue to be turned upside down and whose behaviour is still changed. And I think for some of them, it might end up being lifelong. And that was, deliberately done to them by a government who set out to scare them.
She talks about a battle between science and politics and how fear continues to be used to control people.
People must not allow themselves to be frightened by stories of a disease X, no matter how frightening the stories are, because it's destructive to people's mental health. It's destructive to their rational thinking. And once you lose rational thought, we end up in a crazy world again. And we know what that's like because we've just lived through it. We do not need to go back there again.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders, I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with Dr Clare Craig, diagnostic pathologist and co-chair of the HART Group. Clare, welcome back.
Thanks very much for having me back on, Lee.
So we last sat down around a year ago, and since then you've released your excellent book, Expired, COVID, the Untold Story. You start and end the book by talking about cloud COVID land, which is obviously a take on the cloud cuckoo land, but it did feel like quite a crazy time. Can you start by just telling us how you kind of moved out of cloud COVID land?
Yeah, so I tried to be really honest in this book and just tell the story about how I fell for some of the fear-mongering at the beginning, because I think, the vast majority of people did. There's a tiny number who managed to see through it, but I was one of the ones that was scared, and that changed how I thought about everything. And for me, the sort of period where I started to wonder what was really going on was from summer 2020. And that was specifically because I could see a problem with the diagnostic testing, which was my area of expertise. And so I was digging into that one particular area and still believing really everything else I'd been told. And when I investigated it and looked through the data, I could show that we were overdiagnosing COVID in the summer. It wasn't the people who had it and were dying of it, were in hospital with it, were completely different characteristics to the ones from the spring. And so I thought, well, what do I do with this information? And I spoke to Carl Hannigan, who I'd actually been at medical school with, and he's the director of the Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine in Oxford, and he had been talking about problems with testing in public. So I sort of sought his advice about what to do, and he said, you just have to say it out loud in public, which meant setting up a social media profile and writing a blog and doing things which are not really my style. But I did them, and I was so naive. I honestly expected one of two outcomes. I thought either they're going to say, oh, thanks very much, we hadn't noticed that, we'll look into it. Or they'll say, oh no, don't worry about that, you're wrong because of X, Y, and Z. I thought that like, those were the two outcomes, but that's not what happened. What happened was I was roundly attacked and at the same time introduced to a whole load of people who had doubts from their area of expertise. And of course for me, that wasn't necessarily very helpful, because I don't have expertise in all those areas, and you kind of think, well, maybe this person is wrong and all the experts in their area were right. And so you end up having to kind of learn each of them from first principles to try and figure out who's actually got an evidence base behind them. But it turned out quite a lot of them had, and I started talking about those things as well. And then ended up co-chairing the HART Group, who are a group of doctors and scientists, statisticians, ethicists, psychotherapists, all sorts of skill sets, who all had concerns and wanted to kind of show what the evidence was really showing and what the evidence had shown for decades often in these areas. This is we were in this very odd situation of being a minority group of scientists saying, we think this is wrong. And when that's happened historically, the minority group have to climb a huge mountain to prove their case. But the position we were in is that we had decades of scientific evidence behind us. And the case we were proving, the sort of official story, was really all pretty made up without the evidence base to back it up, which is why there was so much censorship and suppression of people like us, because that's all they could do, right? If you don't have the evidence to show that we're wrong, because it wasn't there, you just end up having to suppress people.
In your book, you're looking at some of the widely held beliefs, and then with the benefit of hindsight and all the meticulous research you've done, looking at whether they stand up to scrutiny. Obviously, we can't go through them all, there's 400 pages. Our viewers can read it and find out that, but I wanted to look at some of them. And so one is COVID, the lockdowns, the idea behind the lockdowns being we isolate everyone, and then because there's no close contact, it stops the virus from spreading. How correct was that approach?
So that approach was based entirely on the premise that spread was occurring because of droplet transmission. So this was the idea that Fauci just last week said, I don't know where that appeared from, which is not the best way to make your policy based on ideas you have no idea what the evidence base is. And when you dig into what the evidence base is, it largely seems to have arisen from a public health officer called Charles Chapin, who in 1910 wrote a textbook on public health and infectious diseases, which sort of became a bit of a Bible and a cornerstone for that area of science. And he was a kind of interesting character. So he's a little bit sort of OCD and germophobic. And he writes about how he hates it when he goes to conferences and people lick their fingers and turn the page and then he has to touch that page. Or people are holding on to things or touching windowsills, or he doesn't like the idea of other people's saliva being on their fingers, touching things, and then he has to touch them. He's really paranoid about it. And so from that baseline, actually, to be fair, there's a little bit more to the story. So the other side of his story is he had evidence that in infectious disease wards, if you separate the beds, the risk of infection is lower. And so he was really evangelical about that because he wanted to reduce, harm to his patients. And he found that he couldn't persuade people to do this. Obviously, it's expensive, it takes up more room, you have fewer beds in the ward. And they didn't want to do it. And they mainly used the excuse for not doing it, that they thought that infectious diseases spread through the air. And so if it's going to spread through the air in the ward anyway, it doesn't really matter where your bed is. And so he wanted rid of that thinking. So this was 1910. So this, we're talking like 60 years after the first sort of germ theory proponents had, managed to crack the glass ceiling and were starting to be heard. So germ theory was a really well accepted phenomenon. There's lots of microscopy going on. So people, everyone was happy with the idea that it was a germ spreading the illness. But of course, germ theory had arisen, had to fight against the idea that disease was spread through bad smells. So that was what was the always belief, going back to Tudor times when people would hold their pocket full of posies and their, all the smells that they'd use to try to protect themselves. And he thought that this idea was just a hangover from the pre-germ theory of miasma, this bad smell spread. And because he thought it was a hangover, he wanted rid of it. And he says in his book, he wants to rid the world of the sewer gas bogey. So this idea that the smells from the sewage are what's spreading disease. And so he's really evangelical and adamant and just draws a line under it and says all disease spread for all infectious disease is spread through mouth spray that will fall within 6 foot of a person who's speaking. And he didn't have evidence to back that up. And he admitted he didn't. And he was very broadly sweeping in saying it was every infectious disease. He made an exception for TB because they'd shown hamsters could catch it on wards if they're put into cages in up by the ceiling. So there was already evidence for TB that was, not relevant. And so he concludes his book saying, I have been a bit broad brush. It probably doesn't apply to all of these diseases, but this is the sort of thinking currently, and we've got to do loads more work in this area to really unpick how it, the detail of it. So it's a bit hard to kind of blame it all on him when 100 plus years later, where we haven't actually found out anything much more. Or rather the kind of medical community haven't. Other communities have. So physicists have done tons of research about aerosol spread of infectious diseases. And the details of that are, really well established, but they were sort of locked out of the epidemiology and virology community at conferences. And so all of their work was just ignored, frankly. And it was only with COVID that they really had to push and push to get heard, writing open letters and, shouting about their knowledge. And finally, it took until December 2021 for the WHO to finally move from saying that aerosol spread was misinformation, which is what they had been saying, to saying that SARS-CoV-2 spread through long-distance aerosol transmission.
111 years later, we get to that point.
I mean, it is a bit ridiculous. It is really, really ridiculous, and just shows how dangerous it is when medicine becomes politicised, because and maybe that's a human trait rather than a political one, that, people have their little theories and they stand by them, they don't like conflict, and they don't like their territories being invaded upon, and so people aren't really listening to each other, and they're not really learning from each other. They're all just, sticking their flag in the ground and saying, this is my belief, and you're not going to trample over it, which is a real problem, and it has really been exposed by what's happened over the last few years. But I mean, besides these physicists, there's really good evidence from SARS-1 that it spread through the air. Right. We knew. So there was one study of a Hong Kong apartment block where there were some infected people in a downstairs apartment where there were 6 blocks arranged in a hexagon shape, and people predicted that the disease would spread to the upstairs apartments of the blocks that were in the direction of the wind currents, and that's exactly what happened. You think, well, if you've got a virus that's spreading at night when there's no UV light through the wind between apartments, there's not much you can do about that. And the evidence is that the modelling, which was assuming close contact, droplet spread, would lead to a peak in cases in July 2020. Yeah. So it was meant to keep spreading and keep spreading and keep spreading and peak in July 2020. Locking down was meant to slow that, which means it should have peaked after July 2020. And it obviously went right through the population, really rapidly, peaked and fell almost immediately. And that's the difference between person-to-person transmission, which takes a long, long time for spread to occur, and spread through the air, where people's interactions are irrelevant to that. It's just happening. And that's why you see a variant arise almost instantaneously across the country and pretty much across the world, because it's just in the air.
Based on this, how effective were the 2-metre rule and the enforced wearing of face masks?
They weren't effective at all. And the thing with the face masks is that if the droplet story had been true, they would have made an impact. If the droplet story had been partially true, because there's also that possibility, isn't there, that, it's spread in both ways. So if it had been partially true, it still should have made some impact, because you'd be reducing dosages or whatever. Although in actual fact, the majority of the virus is in the aerosols. And although the droplets are much bigger, and you'd think, well, that must mean they've got more virus in, that's not the case at all. And we know from just looking at the real-world evidence of what happened with mask mandates that there's no benefit. In fact, so when you compare a region that had mandates against a region that didn't, the one with the mandates almost invariably does a little bit worse. And that included when Austria and Germany used the N95 masks, which are designed to filter out aerosols. So it's not a mechanical filter, because you can't really get a fabric you can breathe through that's got small enough holes to be a mechanical filter. But they charged them with electrostatic electricity, and so that it would filter out aerosols. But the thing is that if you're wearing an N95 mask and you're out and about, the likelihood is you're well. The people who are spreading disease are the ones who are sick. And so they're at home without a mask on, breathing out millions and millions of virus particles into the air, which then spreads to the region around where they are. And there's really nothing you can do about that happening. And when you look at the volume of virus that occurs in a wave, you sort of get a proper feel of how inevitable it is that people will be exposed. And then, of course, if you're wearing a mask, you're going to take it off. or put it on. And that means you're touching it, and that's a really high risk of exposure when you're doing that. And the highest levels of virus in a hospital environment are in the room where people are taking the equipment on and off. So, that you can't help that if you're going to be wearing them. And then obviously you don't wear it all the time. You take it off, and at night when you're eating, when you're not wearing it all the time, so you're not protected all the time. And if it's in the air, you're going to get exposed. And then, there was also the theory that you can catch it through the eyes. So even if you were protected, you're not doing it properly. So, I think the evidence that the masks don't work is so thorough now. And there was a pretty strong evidence base before we went into any of this. And now, it's just got stronger.
When we started out, we weren't going down the masks route for a start.
That's
and
right.
Everyone had that idea that they weren't effective, and suddenly we were.
Yeah, and so we've got, the same people telling stories about how it's not good for, you end up fiddling with them, you end up catching it, there's no point doing it. Just, turning on a dime and saying the opposite, and then turning back again more recently to go back to what the evidence says. You think, well, these are people you can't trust then, aren't they? And yet they're still in positions of authority and giving out public health guidelines, and they need to be replaced because they've completely trashed their trust capital, which is what public health is all about. Public health relies entirely on people believing what they say, and it's important for a whole range of different things, and they've trashed it for everything based on this one virus. It was a crazy approach for them to have taken.
Another thing that became part of our lives, quite an annoying part really, was these PCR tests. Illnesses are usually diagnosed by a professional, but we became a nation of self-diagnosers. Was that effective, and what were the consequences of that?
Yeah, so the thing with diagnostics is that, as you say, it's a medical specialty, diagnostics, and that's because how you interpret a test depends very much on the situation that causes you to take the test. So, if you're testing an old man for prostate cancer signal in their bloodstream, then if you've got high PSA level, then it's meaningful. If you do that same test on a little boy, it's just rubbish. It couldn't possibly have any meaning. And so you've got that same situation with this illness, that when you've got healthy people who are testing, the interpretation of a positive test has to be completely different to when you've got somebody who's got the right kind of symptoms testing. And so that's why normally, you make intelligent decisions about how you test and how often you test, and you don't just assume every single positive is positive and every single negative might be wrong, which seems to have been the approach. And of course, neither of those are true. They're just not true, either of them. And I think the testing ultimately was a massive waste of money. I don't think it achieved anything in terms of reduction in disease because it was spread long distance through the air. So even when you're trying to do, close contact spread reduction, it can't have that impact. And then it obviously fueled the fear by massively escalating the size of the problem in people's minds, and being able to throw around huge numbers on the news every day. And there's actually an additional problem, which is that if you're testing in a hospital environment, then you've got a situation where there's virus in the air. There just is virus in the air in a hospital environment. And so if you've got somebody who's ill for another reason, they're much more likely to test positive than anyone else, because they'll be run down their immune system, so they might have more virus from this virus in the air, but it's not necessarily a cause of any of their problems, but they're more likely to test positive. And so then you get a very distorted view. You end up with situations where you've got children or pregnant women who are on intensive care for another condition, and a lot of pregnancy complications end up with respiratory problems. So they've got respiratory failure, and so everyone's at the top of their mind in that environment is thinking COVID, and they go test, and eventually it comes back positive. And so a woman who might have been on intensive care for preeclampsia or for another reason that's led to respiratory failure is being labelled as a COVID admission. And I'm not saying there weren't pregnant women who did have COVID, of course there were. It's just that the accuracy of the diagnosis starts to fall. And one study in Spain from back in 2020 they looked at the intensive care PCR positives. So these are people where the intensive care doctors thought they had COVID. They had PCR positive for COVID, and they did antibodies afterwards for these patients, and only half of them had antibodies. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So, that just shows it's not perfect. It's just not perfect. And so when you're trying to make a diagnosis, you have to take a lot of the whole story, the symptoms, the story about how they might have caught something, and you do the PCR and you do the antigen testing and you do the antibody testing, and it's the whole picture is what tells you what's really going on. And with a lot of the testing, what didn't happen was following people up. So when people were checking how well the antigen tests worked, for example, they'd compare them to PCR, which we already knew was flawed. And they would never, they would get a handful of people who were positive. It wasn't huge numbers. And they could have followed those people up, seen how many of them ended up with symptoms, and shown how many of them got antibodies. That's not a difficult thing to do, and it was just never, ever done.
A lot of fundamental freedoms were taken away during the pandemic time, like really fundamental, such as going to work, going to school, socialising, going for a walk in the countryside. Do you think it saved lives and protected the NHS to take those freedoms away?
No, I absolutely don't. And I think, in fact, it killed people. So, there were plenty of people who, when they were being repeatedly told to stay home and protect the NHS, did just that. And so when they actually needed healthcare, they didn't turn up. And you can see it in the data. The number of people coming to the hospitals for emergency conditions was through the floor. It fell to about half of normal levels. And there was a study from Milan which showed that people who had life-threatening surgical emergencies, like appendicitis, something that's going to kill you if you don't get the operation, the numbers of people turning up for those halved. I mean, it's really insane. People genuinely didn't, the people you would have thought had no choice but to go and seek medical care didn't seek medical care. And a group of pathologists in Oxford reported on postmortems they did during that first lockdown. And it included, somebody who was dying because they were having a heart attack, and they phoned 999, and they were told they should self-isolate because they had a cough or a fever, and that happened to someone with diabetic ketoacidosis, and then they died. So, we were not providing healthcare the way that we should, so people died from that. And I guess the second part of your question about freedoms and what does it mean when what are the sort of, is there a benefit? Right? Is there a benefit of taking away people's freedom? And the answer really has to be no, because there's, people will have argued the same arguments again and again. So one argument people will say is, what if it was Ebola? Right, that's a favourite. And Ebola is a scary disease. It has a high mortality rate. Yeah. But it's spread through close contact with bodily fluids of somebody who's infected. So you quarantine the sick. You don't need to lock down the healthy. So that's Ebola. And then you've got situations like we had, where you've got airborne transmission of a virus. Now, it doesn't actually matter how deadly that virus is if you can't do anything about its spread, right? The logic is not around, oh, but it's scary. If interventions aren't working, you don't do them regardless because it's pointless. So that's airborne transmission. So then you're left with a sort of middle ground of illnesses that are spread through close contact but aren't going to make you as sick as Ebola. So they're essentially the kind of gastroenteritis category. So diseases spread through the fecal-oral route. And what we saw in the data when we did lockdown, so we've done the experiment for this, the people who showed up to hospital with gastroenteritis, the levels halved. So people were still catching it was still going on, it halved. And given that the levels of general attendance halved too, maybe nothing changed. But let's assume it did actually halve. All you would be doing then by locking down is slowing the spread. Now remember what I said about July 2020 being the modelling for peak in contact, close contact transmission. So you're going from something that would have peaked after 3 months and then fallen 3 months later. So it would have been a 6-month trajectory. If you're slowing the spread of that, then you're likely destroying society for a year. And so then you're having to weigh up, you're not saying that you're stopping this disease. You can't stop a disease. You're slowing the spread from 6 months to a year. Is that really worth doing? And the answer is probably not, because it's so slow anyway. So those are the scenarios, and there isn't a scenario there where lockdown is going to be the answer. And that's why it wasn't in any of the pandemic plans anywhere in the world, because it wouldn't work. It's not worth having. It's not, and it's clearly going to be harmful. It was quite clear from the outset it was going to cause harm, and we now know that it did.
I mean, if we look at fear and psychological manipulation, they were also used sparingly, really, to control what people were going to do. I mean, do you think that was justified, or do you think that's ever justified for a government to use those techniques on its own people?
I absolutely don't. I think it was incredibly unethical. And when they did that, they seem to have spent no time thinking about the consequences of it or how to undo it. And we're suffering the consequences still. You know, there are people, including young people, who remain terrified and whose whole lives continue to be turned upside down and whose behaviour is still changed. And I think for some of them, it might end up being lifelong. And that was, you know, deliberately done to them by a government who set out to scare them, you know, with that sort of Spy B document, which said they had to raise the level of personal threat felt by people who correctly weren't scared of something that wasn't a threat to them. You know, if you look at the mortality, yes, some younger people have died, small numbers, but almost very, very few healthy young people. Now, you have to compare that to what happened before. So we're not saying, you know, these people, yes, some young people have died, but young people die every single year of respiratory viruses, every single year. And it's horrible and it's tragic for their families, and, you know, my heart goes out to them. But that doesn't mean that it's something we can do something about. You know, ultimately, the way that biology works is some people's immune systems aren't fit for the viruses that are around. And for a couple of years, we had a different virus that was dominant through the winters. And so, you know, they died with a different label attached to them. But it was just a similar proportion to whatever would have happened before. And I think it's really important to keep that sense of perspective. And instead, any stories like that have been, you know, absolutely amplified in the press. So then one of the classic stories, I don't know if you remember, there was a story about a 13-year-old dying back in 2020, I think. And his family couldn't attend the funeral because they had to be isolated. And he died alone in hospital because they'd had to be isolated. And so this obviously was a story that really pulled at the heartstrings of the nation. And it was really the only story of a child dying like that, because the other children that died were terminally ill with other problems, actually. So this story really did the rounds. And then it came to inquest, and at inquest, the coroner found that really the cause of death had been an attempt to put a tube into his trachea that had gone wrong. And, you know, obviously tragic, awful, but you can't then pretend that was because of the virus and then use that story to manipulate parents into vaccinating their children. That was just really wrong to do that.
It seems the main approach of dealing with COVID-19 was prioritise looking after the elderly. And we just thought, you know, the young people, they're resilient and whatever happens, they'll be fine. We close the schools for a year, teachers wear masks, etc. But do you think we let the young people and children down during that time?
I think we treated them terribly, and I think you can really judge a society by how it treats its children. And only we got into a situation where parents were being manipulated into abusing their children, and when they were sick, they were left isolated and had, you know, being handed. One story I was told last night was of food being handed on a tennis racket to a child. It just, yeah, awful, awful. And children, you know, haven't really recovered. There's some children that will never recover. So, for example, the evidence that masking impacted on language development is just terrifying, and is only just, you know, a tip of the iceberg of what that really means. You know, you've changed children's brain development, and there are windows of time in children's brain development when they're learning around facial expressions and, you know, what the meanings behind all of that. And yet there were nurseries where the staff were masked, you know, because those were the rules, looking after babies who are trying to learn how to interpret faces. And we're going to see that, you know, we're going to see knock-on effects of this for years and years. And that's just, you know, that's just the masking problem. And then you come to the, you know, children who are slightly older, for whom social interactions are absolutely fundamental to their development. And they can't go back and do that again. You know, for you and I, sort of a year of our lives, you can shrug off actually, and you just get on and start afresh. But when you are a child, you don't get that year back. That's part of your development. It will always be part of your growing up, and you might bounce back, you might find ways around it, but you're not able to redo that development stage.
In the book, you ask whether science is the opposite of politics. And if we look at what Sweden did, they kind of put the scientists in charge, and that seemed to work quite well for them. Whereas here it seemed there was a bit of a kind of battle between science and politics, and politics kind of won. I mean, do you think that causes problems? Absolutely.
And I mean, obviously it wasn't just here. You know, Sweden was really the exception. Japan was another exception, actually. They have laws around the interference between public health and the government similarly. But yeah, so the trouble with anybody playing at medicine is that they tend not to be cautious enough. So we have the foundational ethical principle in medicine of first do no harm. And the reason that's reiterated so much is that any medical student or even junior doctor, they always end up too eager to do stuff because, you know, they want to help, right? It comes from the sort of place of caring. And as you get more and more senior, you become more and more willing to wait, watch, to see what's going to happen before stepping in, because you realise that, you know, every time you intervene, you are risking harm. Right. And so, you know, obviously there are times when you absolutely should, but there's often nothing wrong with just being careful about when you do that. And so, you know, that's why it's drummed into us, first do no harm, through our medical training. Now, what essentially seemed to happen is that the reins were handed to politicians who were behaving like medical students. And they were really excited about doing something without anyone senior to them telling them to be cautious. And so we had this real perversion where the precautionary principle, which is that principle that says you don't do anything because it might cause unexpected harm. So you have to be very certain that what you're going to do will have a benefit, and you need to be pretty sure that it's not going to cause a harm before you go and do it. And that idea was not only disregarded for all of the interventions, but it was also turned on its head and used to sort of make the opposite claims, to say things like, well, if we don't mask, there might be harm, so we really ought to do that. And if we don't lock down, there might be harm, so we ought to do that. So the whole principle was inverted and the thing is that people haven't recognised that. And until that's been recognised, we're still in a situation where that can be abused again.
If there was another pandemic next month, I mean, do you think we've learned the lessons we need to learn? Do you think we would do any better?
If there's another pandemic next month, you can bet it's not really a pandemic, okay? So the thing with pandemic is an incredibly powerful word. It's up there with vaccine as a powerful word. So, you know, in our minds, pandemic is a sort of uncontrolled outbreak of death, right? That's what it means. And that's what it should mean. And it can be used in a meaningful way when talking about the Black Death and the plague. Although I think we have to admit we don't know everything about those stories either, and we probably never will. And then you get to the 1918 story, which is the one that everybody always wants to hark back to. What happened in 1918? Because a lot of people did die then. And there was an influenza then. And like with SARS-CoV-2, it came in waves, and it took 3 waves to go through about a third of the population, so about 10% per wave. but young people were dying and pregnant women were dying disproportionately. And so that became the definition of a pandemic, was something where young people and pregnant people and children are at risk of dying. Because the fact is, we've got infectious diseases that where deaths in the old are attributed to these diseases every winter. We don't really know how direct the causal link is, but they're attributed every winter, and that's just life. So that's life. So the only reason to actually give something a name is when something different's happening, which is the young dying. But when you look into 1918 a little bit harder, it's really not the story that everybody's being told on a number of levels. So on one level, the number of people who died was something they could measure pretty accurately. You know, counting dead bodies is something people were very, very good at 100 years ago. And so they had good data and they had a good feel for how many people had died in the US, in Europe. And in 1920, somebody did a modelling study to try to figure out how many people died around the world. And in this modelling study, they took what they knew from Europe and the USA, and they said, well, we have to assume that we did really well. So everywhere, the rest of the world probably had much higher mortality rate. So we'll factor that in. And they came up with a figure of 20 million people having died. So I think that's probably an exaggeration, which we'll come to in a minute. In the meantime, every year that figure has got bigger. Right. And so the people who use that figure in publications are epidemiologists and virologists whose career and income is entirely reliant on this fear of pandemics. So they want a big number. You wouldn't believe how big that number has got. It's got to 100 million people. 100 million people are said to die by the Wellcome Trust page on this.
So it was 20? It
was 20, and that was probably too many. And the thing with the 100 million figure is that if you look at the case fatality rate, so not the infection fatality rate, but you know the proportion of people who died who were sort of in medical care, it's 2-3%, and everyone accepts that. There's no arguing that it's 2-3%. And if you take that 2-3% and you're 100 million, you're very quickly at a number of people being infected where you struggle to have that many people in the world. So, you know, it's nonsense. And yet everyone shares this number. And the other aspect of it, which isn't talked about enough, but I think is really important, is that at the time there was this wonder drug that was being used to treat people who had fever called aspirin. And as a wonder drug, and a new wonder drug, people hadn't quite worked out the sort of, you know, the rules around how you used it. And because people were scared, they were really, really scared. So when someone they loved was sick, they were handing them handfuls of aspirin. And there's, you know, quite detailed stories about what happened with aspirin. And people were taking huge quantities of it and dying in a different way to influenza deaths. So there's a sort of two stories about how people died. On the one hand, you have the typical influenza, where people are ill for some time, and then they sort of deteriorate with a pneumonia, and then it becomes a secondary bacterial pneumonia, and then they die from the bacterial pneumonia because there's no antibiotics. And so that's quite a long, drawn-out trajectory that's very familiar to doctors. In 1918, young people were dying with heavily wet hemorrhagic lungs, this very distinctive rash they called a heliotrope rash, because they went blue, because they were just, you know, unable to oxygenate properly because of the aspirin toxicity. So, you know, I think that story really needs looking at more closely because it's such an important story, and people hang a lot of dread off that story when actually it's not what it seems at all. And then, of course, since then, we've had pandemics, right? There was a 1957 flu pandemic and a 1968 flu pandemic. And what that meant was there were new strains of influenza that were, the influenza mutates a little bit every year, and then sometimes it does a big jump. And these were big jumps. But even with the big jumps, you can't pick out from a graph of mortality those years. So yeah, more people might have died of flu that year, but then they died of less of other stuff or whatever. So it's not this kind of, you know, the point of pandemic planning is to stop something catastrophic killing young people. There's no point pandemic planning if what a pandemic is just a regular virus passing through population the same way it does every year, and old people dying because they're at the end of their life, pretty much, that's not what you would change society for in any way. And of course, there are plenty of people who've got careers based on this, for whom what I'm saying is blasphemy, because they have the rug totally pulled from underneath them if they admitted that this was the case. But this is the case. And so now suddenly everybody's talking about pandemics and they're trying to scare people, and we're hearing a lot at the moment about disease X and how the vaccine's already ready for disease X. And then there was also a story last week about some mice study where the 4 mice died from a mutant virus in mice that were very atypical. They had changed their genetics to be humanoid. I mean, it's not like they're not humans, and they're not really mice either. And 4 of them died. And I could show you a whole load of stories of mice dying in laboratory experiments that you shouldn't get scared of either. And so I think, people must not allow themselves to be frightened by stories of a disease X, no matter how frightening the stories are, because it's destructive to people's mental health. It's destructive to their rational thinking. And once you lose rational thought, we end up in a crazy world again. And we know what that's like because we've just lived through it. We do not need to go back there again. And so I think people have to be awake to that and say, look, I'm not going to be afraid. You can't frighten me.
What can we do when even these powerful organisations are taking a 20 million figure and turning it into a 100 million figure to push a certain argument? I mean, how can an ordinary person deal with that?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I think ordinary people can completely understand that once it's explained to them. It's not rocket science, it's just fraud. And, people get fraud, and we just have to be telling everybody that is what's happened and calling it out, because it's outrageous. It's absolutely outrageous that that's been allowed to happen, and that, that nobody has ever stopped in that industry and said, look, guys, exaggerating a bit, aren't we?
So you took a lot of flack from speaking out, particularly towards the start of it all. What was that like? And looking back, would you do anything differently? So
I did take a lot of flack, and there were periods where it was, it took its toll on me. I didn't stop doing it because of it, but it was wearing. I'd find some days when I would be quite low about it. And I'm writing in another book now in which there's a chapter that sort of records what all the names I've been called. And it really hurts still reading it all back in one place like that, because it's a bit intense seeing it, all in one spot. So I don't like editing that bit. Self-flagellation recorded on those days. Yeah. And what I've come to realise over time is that a lot of these people weren't actually people anyway. And, so to take things personally in a cyber situation where you don't even know who these people are, it's a bit foolish to let that go to your heart. And I've ended up really tough. And so it was horrible going through it, but I've come out the other side, and you can't break me like that. Excellent. And as you said, it's not stopped me doing it, and I would absolutely do it again. Although I'm not entirely sure what I was doing it for or what I'm doing it for now, but I would still absolutely do it again, because I couldn't not do it. I felt like I was in a situation where I was more free to speak out than a lot of my colleagues who felt like their careers and mortgage and everything meant that they couldn't take a risk. And so that gave me a sense of a feeling of, well, I've got more of a duty to speak out. And I've already spoken out anyway, so then I'm just going to keep speaking, and I have done. And, it actually feels quite good speaking the truth in a world of lies.
One other issue I wanted to ask you about is excess deaths. I know your research helped Andrew Bridgen with his presentation at the Parliament, etc. Can you tell us a bit about excess deaths? Is it something people should be concerned about?
Absolutely. So, when we're talking about pandemics, right, the whole point with the concern around pandemics is people die when they shouldn't be dying. And what we've seen since 2021 is we've had this stepwise change in how many people are dying, particularly young people, and particularly of cardiovascular causes. And that has been seen globally, or at least in the West. And it was being seen in Australia, which is a really critical part of this story. So Australia had very little COVID before Omicron arrived. So they were vaccinating when any problems with the vaccine couldn't be blamed on COVID because people simply hadn't had it. And there were parts of Australia where that was even more extreme. So South Australia and Western Australia had 1,000 cases in total across the entire states prior to Omicron. So there was just, COVID was not a thing. And yet in South Australia, there is this massive spike in cardiac admissions to hospital in 18 to 44-year-olds, as they do the vaccine rollout. So the vaccine was clearly causing cardiovascular problems in the absence of COVID. And there's similar in Singapore, you can see this rise in mortality at that time, and it was cardiovascular predominantly, and it was before they had COVID. So, we've got pretty clear control countries that show what was going on, and we've had the same here. Now, we have had a sort of slightly more complicated story because the young in the UK had a bit of an excess mortality in autumn 2020. So, I see that as a combination of coming out of lockdown when people have been under immense psychological stress, deliberately by the government, and psychological stress causes heart disease. It causes, the atherosclerosis that leads to heart disease. And that's a little bit of a kind of oddity because it's a sort of, to think that psychological health impacts physical health is a bit of a kind of jump in how Western medicine normally thinks, but the evidence base behind that is solid and has been established for decades. So that I think it was largely that. And you could argue that COVID might have had an impact on that as well. Maybe it did. But, you can't do anything about COVID. So that's not the problem. The problem is if you go and intervene with something you did not have to do and cause a problem with killing young people, that's the big issue. And of course, trying to show the evidence for this has been made way, way harder than it should be. Now, we have the evidence, we have plenty of evidence. And, I'm pretty sad I can say this to you, that this is what has happened. The vaccine has caused this problem. But we don't have all of the evidence that we could have because we're being blocked from getting access to it. And so, when things were starting to turn south, publications that were being produced every week, they just sort of stopped. And, things that started to show a story they didn't want shown, they just stopped showing it to us. And I'm currently preparing evidence for inquests for people who've died young of heart disease when they've just been vaccinated. And I'm pulling together all the evidence from around the world that shows the story about what happened in these people. And you just think, this is ridiculous. We've just got no stories, no evidence, no science from the UK. Where were we? We just were sort of AWOL. We weren't actually doing any of these studies. Well, we're relying on all of the studies from elsewhere in the world. And then we've also got this crazy situation where, if you remember the brain clot story with AstraZeneca, we go back to that. We had a situation where nobody in the UK was said to have died from the vaccine, 0. The MHRA announced that based on Scandinavian data, some people could die from rare brain clots if they'd had AstraZeneca, just that one specific thing. Having announced that, doctors start putting it on the death certificate. Think, okay, this is the wrong way round. How can a regulator raise a concern about a cause of death if the doctors only call it that cause of death when the regulator has raised a concern? It's a complete catch-22. It was never going to get anywhere. And obviously that's continued with everything else. And because other people haven't called things out, we haven't got the evidence. And the thing with the brain clots is it was a very, very rare condition. So something that's exceedingly rare starts happening in a cluster, it's very easy to point the finger. But when you've got a condition that's common, like cardiovascular disease, when you've got atherosclerotic disease that's common, people dismiss it too easily. They'll just say, well, we've seen that before, it's not a problem. And of course, any one doctor is unable to see the whole story, because they'll think, when you're a doctor, when you're practicing, you do sometimes have periods of some odd things coming through the door, and it's not necessarily representative, it's just that's what random looks like. And so you have to be able to actually have the confidence to think that might mean something, and then talk to your colleagues and see if they're saying the same thing. And people talking about the vaccine was such a taboo that those conversations weren't happening. So then you never start to build a picture in the way that you normally could about a condition. And so then you're reliant on data. And we've got data that does show that there was a problem, but it's much easier to show the problem in certain groups like the young, because there's less of a problem normally. But if you're looking at older cohorts, because there's a lot more deaths of cardiovascular disease generally, trying to prove an increase becomes much, much harder.
Do you think attitudes in Westminster are changing to this excess deaths issue?
I really do, actually. I felt really buoyed up by that debate last week, because there were, I think it was 25 in the end, 25 MPs who wanted to speak, which is a sea change. I mean, obviously, that still leaves 625, but it's still a sea change in where we were before. And I think it was about 20 of them, 18 I think, signed up to say, let's have a proper debate in the chamber on this 3-hour debate. And they're putting their names on a piece of paper. I want to talk about this. This is important. And that is a turning point. That absolutely is a turning point. And I feel like we've got to a stage where those politicians who've got a bit of a science background are feeling brave enough to say something. So I do feel for politicians on this, because they're a bit caught between their constituents. So they will have constituents who have told them about harm, and they will have constituents who are concerned about harm, talking to them as well. And then on the other side, they've got the various institutions and bodies who are telling them there isn't a problem. And they, by and large, with the best will in the world, do not have the skill set to navigate that, because generally scientists didn't go into politics, and politicians have arts backgrounds, and so they rely on credentials and experts, and they sit as the judge rather than the investigator. And so having politicians who have got that science background start to call it out, and then they'll be able to start to speak to other politicians and say, look, this doesn't add up. And then that will hopefully give them the confidence to start asking the right questions, which just hasn't been happening. And, it has felt like throwing pebbles at a dam every day, and you just hope that one day one of them's going to chip something off, and it does chip a little bit, and we're still throwing. And I think I do feel like we are going to get there. And I also feel like when we do, it will be one big whoosh of, just because there's so much behind that wall at the moment that's just not breaching.
You mentioned a second book. What's it going to be about?
So when I wrote the book, I wrote it because back in 2021, there was this issue where if you tried to speak to somebody about any of it, you would have to pick a small aspect, and you might persuade them about this small aspect, but they would then leave you, and you could sort of almost hear their cogs turning in their brain as they rejected everything you said because it didn't fit with everything else that they thought they knew. And so I tried to do these beliefs and set out, taking somebody where they were, explain why they thought what they thought, explain why that was wrong, and sort of bring them to where the evidence is. And I thought I wouldn't have enough to say. I've not written a book before. And I ended up writing way too much. And so, that was a sort of half of it. And the other half of it is on the origins and the vaccines and the treatments. And so more controversial, more, although getting less controversial over time, which is the same as that one. That one was controversial as I was writing it. But by the time I got it published, it wasn't so controversial anymore, because it's about lockdowns and masks, and people generally are willing to talk about that now. And about viral spread is what it's really about. But yeah, the next one is about the vaccine, and I've felt like I have been chasing the story, because it has kept moving while I've been trying to get it finished, which is why it's not quite finished yet, but it will be.
Dr Clare Craig, thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me, Lee. Thanks.